Kang Jiho opened his eyes, awakened by the smell of salt and rusty iron. A ceiling made of riveted steel hung above him, and water was dripping from it. He was lying on the floor of a cramped cabin, wearing unfamiliar clothes with no pockets. The last thing he remembered was the night shift at the port and a flash of white light. He got up and stepped out into the hallway where he could already hear unfamiliar voices. The hallway led him out onto the deck of an old dry cargo ship. The ship was called the Carry-On, and that name was stamped on a life buoy. People were standing all around, and there were many of them. Jiko counted them in 10 seconds, 24 people, and he himself was the 25th. Men and women of various ages and from different countries. Everyone was staring blankly out at the ocean. The ocean stretched to the horizon in every direction, and nowhere was there a shore, another ship, or even a bird. A large man with a weather-beaten face announced that he was a former boatswain, and his name was Ortega. He said he was taking command because the rest of them looked like office drones. Several people nodded in agreement. A thin woman with her hair pulled back introduced herself as a doctor named Celine. A gray-haired man in an expensive shirt identified himself as Brant and kept quiet about his profession. At that moment, the air above the deck rang out. Out of nowhere, a voice emerged, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. The voice announced that all 25 passengers had been enrolled in the carrion voyage. Every day, the system would issue a single common task. If the task is completed, the crew gets to keep the ship and its supplies. If they fail, the system will confiscate part of the ship or part of the fresh water supply. The voyage will end when the ship reaches the final destination. The voice did not specify where that destination was. People shouted and demanded explanations, but the voice had already fallen silent. Panic broke out. Someone rushed toward the lifeboats, but the lifeboat davits had been cut off at the base. Ortega barked that they needed to break into the food storage area and take control of the supplies. He grabbed a fire sledgehammer and headed for the steel door in the superstructure. The crowd followed him. Jiho stepped in front of him and stood between the crowbar and the door. He said the door must not be touched. Ortega eyed him warily and asked who he thought he was. Jiko replied that the door hinges were welded shut from the inside and there was a new sensor with a counter on the combing, which meant the door was part of the rules, not part of the ship. He added that the system had designated the supplies as its collateral, and any attempt to take the collateral by force would be counted as a refusal to play the game. Ortega smirked and raised the crowbar. The air rang out again. A voice issued a warning. Unauthorized access to the supplies would be considered a crew refusal to continue the voyage and would result in the confiscation of all fresh water. The crowbar froze in midair. The crowd receded from the door. Ortega slowly lowered the crowbar and looked at Jiko with a different expression. Celine asked quietly how he knew that. Jiko replied that he simply looks at things before breaking them. He didn't mention that he'd worked for 12 years as a ship's mechanic and surveyor, and that he'd inspected half the ship on the way to deck. Let them think of him as a random person. Random people aren't the first to be targeted. At noon, the air rang out for the third time. The system announced the first day's mission. A breach had opened in the forepeak below the waterline. The crew had 4 hours to stop the leak. Failure meant losing the aft tank, which held half the ship's fresh water supply. A timer flashed to life on the panel by the mast. People started shouting again. Brant calmly remarked that it was too early to sink and suggested they at least go down and take a look. Not everyone climbed down into the hold. Jiko counted heads at the ladder. 19 people went down. 6 remained above. Among them, a trembling young man named Casper who kept repeating that he was an accountant, not a diver. Down below, the water was already knee-deep and gushing from a torn gap in the hull. Ortega was giving orders loudly but incoherently. People were hauling some kind of planks and splinters. Jiho silently walked along the side of the ship and found what he was looking for, the emergency kit containing wedges, cement powder, and a roll of canvas.
The system had laid out the tools in advance, and that too was standard procedure. Then the work began, and it merged into a series of bursts of activity. Jiko demonstrated how to drive the wedges into the crack, and the canvas was pressed against the hole by the water pressure. Selin organized a bucket brigade. Ortega used his weight to hold the pressure down while the cement set. By the end of the third hour, the water had stopped pouring in. By the end of the fourth hour, the patch was firmly in place, and the pump had expelled the water overboard. The timer went off 11 minutes before the end. A voice announced that the mission was complete, and then came the moment Jiho had been keeping his eyes open for all day. A personal, translucent plaque hung in front of each participant. Jiho's plaque showed his score, 52.6. He heard the guy to his right read his score aloud, 52.6. The same. Jiko quickly asked Casper how many points he'd been awarded. Casper replied, flustered, that he hadn't been awarded any because he hadn't gone down. Jiho did the math in his head. 52.6 multiplied by 19 participants came to exactly 1,000, a round thousand. The reward wasn't a per-person payout. The reward was a common pot that was divided among the number of participants. 19 people each received 52. 10 people would have received 100 each. 5 people would have received 200 each. Jiko felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. The system had built a trap right into the arithmetic itself. Every smart and greedy person on board would sooner or later come to the same conclusion. The fewer people alive and working, the richer each survivor would be. He looked up and saw Brant standing by his nameplate, his lips moving silently. Brant was multiplying the same numbers. That evening, the crew divided up the canned rations that the system had dispensed through the open storage hatch. Ortega approached Jiho and handed him a can first. The boatswain said that in the morning he'd mistaken him for an office boy, and office boys don't drive wedges in 2 strikes. He asked what Jiho had done for a living before. Jiho replied that he'd worked with metal and left it at that. He didn't sleep that night. He took a flashlight from the emergency kit and went down to the aft hold, which he'd only glanced at briefly during the day. Behind the engine room bulkhead, he found a door without any rust. The door was too new for this ship. Behind the door was a small partition, and inside it stood a console with a dark screen. As soon as Jiho touched the screen, it lit up. The screen displayed his name and his balance, 52.6 points. Below that was a list labeled the Exchange Catalog. A small water purifier for 400 points, a handheld harpoon carbine for 600, a hull repair kit for 300, and at the very bottom of the list was an entry that made Jiko's mouth go dry. An additional crew member, price, 1,000 points. Next to each entry, a note flashed, stating that the catalog was a personal privilege of the discoverer and was not visible to other passengers. Jiko turned off the screen and stood in the darkness for a long time. He realized 3 things at once. First, points aren't a game score. They're the currency of life. Second, he was the only one who could turn points into things and people. Third, if someone like Brant found out about the catalog, the boiler's arithmetic, and the price of 1,000 points would combine into a single, simple, and terrifying scheme. Up above, the air rang out. The system announced the second day's mission ahead of schedule. The voice reported that at dawn, the ballast valve under the Kaon's keel would be opened, and only 5 volunteers wearing diving masks who would be found in the box by the mast would be able to shut it off. Exactly 5, and no more. The voice added that for every volunteer who died, the reward for the survivors would increase. Jiko stood in the dark hold and listened as the crew above woke up and began to shout. The system had just announced aloud the rule he had wanted to keep secret. Now everyone would count him out. Jiko made his way out of the hold just as the sky over the ocean turned gray. The deck was buzzing with voices. People stood in a circle around a box containing 5 diving masks, and no one wanted to come within 3 steps of it. Ortega was calling for volunteers. No volunteers came forward. Brant stood slightly to the side and remained silent, and his silence spoke volumes. Jiho watched as he studied the faces and crunched the numbers. Yesterday's 1,000 divided by 19 had turned today into a pot divided by 5. And if 3 out of 5 returned, the pot would be divided among 3. The system had said this out loud, and the words could not be taken back. Celine declared that sending people under the keel was madness, and that, as a doctor, she forbade the dive without a medical examination. Ortega snapped back that if they didn't shut off the valve, there'd soon be no one left to examine. Casper whispered that he wouldn't go down even under threat of death. Jiho stepped into the center of the circle and grabbed the first mask. He said he was going first because he knew what the ballast valve looked like, and he'd show the other four everything underwater using hand signals. The circle fell silent. Ortega grunted and grabbed the second mask. The third was taken by a quiet, broad-shouldered woman named Nomi, who had been hauling buckets for 2 people the day before. The fourth was taken by the wiry fisherman, Osamu. No one took the 5th mask for a long time. Then the quiet guy, Darien, whose hands were shaking, took it. Jiho led the 4 of them to the side of the boat and put them through a dry run in 10 minutes. He showed them how to clear the mask, how to take turns breathing from the hose, and how to give 3 signals. Ortega watched his hands and finally voiced what he'd been thinking since yesterday. He said they don't teach these techniques on shore and that Jiho was lying about working with metal. Jiho replied that only those who have something to hide lie, and that he simply doesn't like long stories. At dawn, there was a dull clang from beneath the hull, and the carrion began to list to one side. The 5 of them jumped overboard. The water was warm on the surface and freezing at depth. After that, everything condensed into a series of images. A flashlight beam sweeping across the fouled hull, an open valve from which a stream was gushing. Nomi and Osamu are holding the plug. Ortega is hitting the retaining ring with a sledgehammer. Darien at the safety end is tripping over his own feet. Jiho wedged a chalk in place and tightened the ring. And then, from the darkness beneath the keel, a shadow emerged, half the length of the hull. The system hadn't indicated that there was life in this ocean. The shadow passed beneath them, and a surge of water knocked Darien off the rope. The guy gasped for air and spat out his mouthpiece. Chico was right beside him after 3 strokes. He shoved the mouthpiece back in and dragged Darien upward along the rope. Once above, they were all pulled onto the deck at once. The valve was sealed shut, and the timer went dark. A voice announced that the mission had been completed by 5 participants, with no casualties. The scoreboards lit up, 200 points each for the 5 of them. The crowd stared at the numbers in silence, and in that silence, something was born that Jiko feared more than a shark under the keel. Envy was already dividing the crew into those who had taken the risk and those who hadn't made it in time. That evening, Brant gathered about 6 people around him and spoke quietly. Jiko walked by and caught a snippet of the conversation. Brant was explaining that the volunteers were now rich and that wealth on this ship meant power over future rewards. He wasn't sowing rebellion but accounting, and that was worse than rebellion. Celine intercepted Jiko at the gangway and said she'd checked on Darien and that the guy had swallowed a lot of water but was alive. Then she asked him point blank why Jiko had gone in first, if he was smarter than everyone else on board. Jiko replied that that was exactly why he'd gone in. That night, he went back down to the console. The balance read 252.6. He opened the catalog and began reading it, as one would read a blueprint. A desalination unit for 400 would solve the water problem once and for all and render the system's main lever obsolete. A repair kit for 300 made holes a routine matter. A carbine for 600 was power in its purest form. And the line about a crew member for 1,000 remained silent on the most important point: who would come at that price, and from where? Jiho noticed a small footnote at the bottom of the screen that he'd missed on the first night. The note stated that purchases would materialize at a location of the catalog owner's choosing, and that the owner could assign a cover story to the purchase. The system wasn't just offering him items. The system was offering him a turnkey lie. He bought the repair kit for 300 and specified the far corner of the forepeak under the old tarpaulin as the spawn point. His balance dropped to just under 100, and Jiko felt this drop like a moment of breathlessness. In the morning, the system announced the task for the 3rd day. The voice reported that within 24 hours, the crew must retrieve 3 crates marked with cargo labels from the flooded forepeak, and that the failure would result in the galley being taken away. Juko almost laughed. The system was sending people right to where his purchase lay under the tarp.
He went down to the forepeak with the first 5-man team, and while the others were attaching the slings, he pulled back the tarp and said loudly that a factory hull repair kit was lying there. Ortega lifted the lid and whistled.
Inside were clamps, resin, sheet metal, and tools covered in oil.
The boatswain said that this box hadn't been there yesterday because he'd personally searched the forepeak down to the last nut. He placed a lantern on the box and looked Jiko in the eye. Jiko shrugged and replied that the ship fucking big and his memory's short. Ortega didn't smile. He said his memory was excellent and that someone with sticky fingers had gotten on board this ship. The crew hauled the cargo crates up at sunset, and the pot was split 22 ways, coming out to 45 points each. And that night, something happened that turned envy into action. Someone broke into Seelan's medical station and stole half the bandages and all the alcohol. A mark from a crowbar was left on the door. The crowbar was found right there by the gangway, and it was Ortega's. Brant feigned surprise and proposed, by a vote, to lock the boatswain in the rope locker until the matter was clarified. 6 of his companions were the first to raise their hands. Jeku looked at that forest of raised hands and understood the scheme. Brant was removing the only person with a commanding voice, and at the same time pinning the first crime on him. Jiko stepped forward and said that the mark on the door had been left by a crowbar with a straight blade, whereas Ortega's crowbar had a bent blade, and he invited everyone to come forward and compare them. The men came forward and compared them. The marks didn't match. The voices fell silent. Brant spread his arms and said that justice was more important than theories. He smiled, and that smile meant he'd remembered who had broken his first lock. Jiko returned to his cabin and lay down fully clothed. He fell asleep with a single thought. Brant had 6 hands in his pocket, while he himself had only a catalog and less than 100 points. He needed his own people, and the price for his own people started at 1,000. Just before dawn, the air rang out with an unscheduled announcement. A voice announced an emergency notice. Due to the crew's activity, the system was implementing a nighttime threat rating. The voice said that from now on, every night one passenger would be marked as prey, and their death before dawn would double the bounty for the next mission. The first mark had been assigned. Jiko felt a burning sensation on the back of his hand. A crimson mark was appearing on his skin. Jiko stood in the darkness of his cabin, staring at the glowing mark. The mark burned his skin and promised that they would come for him before dawn. He assessed the situation in a minute. Hiding was pointless because the ship was doomed. Fighting alone was foolish because the hunters wouldn't come alone. All that remained was to make a move that no one would anticipate. He stepped out onto the deck alone and struck the bell. The crew scrambled toward the mast, sleepy and angry. Jeho raised his hand, marked with a target above his head, and said that the system had designated him as prey, and that a double boiler reward awaited anyone willing to take it. Then he said a second thing. He said that whoever killed him today would wake up tomorrow with a mark of their own because the system had already shown how much it enjoyed pitting people against each other, and the threat rating wouldn't stop at just one night. He offered the crew a deal. All marks are announced aloud, and the person marked at night is guarded by 4 people chosen by lot. Celine was the first to say that the doctor would participate in this deal without being chosen by lot. Ortega stood silently next to Jiho, and his silence spoke louder than words. Noemi and Osamu approached next. Brant applauded and called the agreement noble. Then he asked how much nobility was worth when the pot was doubled. He didn't argue, he simply left the figure hanging in the air. The night passed on guard duty. Twice, someone approached the edge of the light, and twice retreated back into the shadows. At dawn, the mark on his palm faded, and a voice announced that the catch had survived the night and the boiler remained normal. Jiho unclenched his fist and saw that his nails had pierced his skin. The system issued the assignment for the 4th day at noon. The voice reported that within 6 hours, the crew must clear the Kingstons of fouling. Otherwise, the system would seize the Bow fresh water tank. The work was dirty but simple, and nearly everyone signed up for it. The ship was divided into 23 sections, and the tasks were small. Jiko worked alongside everyone else and counted something else. He counted water. After the aft tank was drained on the first day, there was enough reserve to last 9 days under strict rationing. The system was focused on one thing, and that thing was thirst. In the evening, he went down to the console and checked the balance, 140-something. They were 260 short of the desalination unit. He went back upstairs and did what he'd been waiting to do for a long time. He gathered a team of 5 divers and Sailen and offered them a separate assignment. He said he'd spotted a loophole in the system's rules. Missions have a base quota, but the system awards a bonus for speed and for avoiding losses, and the bonus is individual for each person. He proposed that from now on, they go out on missions as a small squad first and take on the most dangerous sections themselves. He didn't mention the most important part, that the bonuses were needed for a secret shared account, and that this account was located behind a new door in the aft hold. Ortega asked point blank what Jiho stood to gain from this. Jiko replied that his interest lay in surviving the voyage with people he could trust with his back turned. The boatswain thought for a long time and then held out his hand, and so a squad emerged on the carrion that they called among themselves the Bow Watch. The mission on the 5th day revealed why the watch was necessary. A voice announced a storm and ordered them to hoist the storm-lashing lines within 4 hours, secure the cargo in the holds, and reef the tarps over the hatches. Otherwise, the system would seize the infirmary. The sky on the horizon was already a solid wall. What followed was a scene of water and metal. Nomi tightens the lashing rope, bracing her foot against the cleat. Osamu secures the cargo in the hold, while crates slide across the deck. Ortega leads people along the lashing line across the flooded deck. Cillian ties tires and people to their berths' bunks. Jekko at the helm kept the bow pointed into the waves because it turned out the wheel was responsive and no one else knew how to stay on course. Carrion groaned, but kept going. By nightfall, the storm had subsided, and a voice announced the mission's completion with a bonus for no casualties. Jiko's personal tally showed 180 bonus points. His total had surpassed 400. He waited until the dead of night and bought a desalinator. As the point of origin, he indicated a niche behind the bulwark near the forepeak, and as the story behind it, he chose the factory-sealed emergency kit. In the morning, he led Ortega to the niche, as if by accident. The boatswain ripped off the tarp and froze. The small desalinator stood on a sled, and the seal gleamed like new. Ortega was silent for a minute. Then he said that he'd been at sea for 30 years, and that machines like that didn't just appear on ships by themselves. He turned to Jiho and asked point-blank whether Jiho thought the boatswain was an idiot. Jiho held his gaze and replied that the boatswain wasn't an idiot and that one day he'd explain everything, but today the crew needed water, not explanations. Ortega looked him in the eyes for a long time. Then he said he'd keep that in mind and would take the machine to the tank himself. The desalinator started working by noon and produced the first 1.5 liters. People came over and touched the warm, fresh water with their fingers as if it were a miracle. Casper, who had spent the past week looking at Jiko as if he were an upstart, filled a mug, took a sip, and burst into tears. He said he'd been certain they'd all die of thirst, and that he'd been wrong about this ship and its people. Jiko looked at the crying accountant and felt no victory. He had calculated correctly. The desalinator had quenched their thirst. Thirst was the system's whip. The system does not forgive when its whip is taken away. And that evening, the system proved that he had calculated correctly. The air rang out, and a voice announced that it was detecting an unauthorized increase in the ship's infrastructure. The voice said that the voyage's balance would be restored and that tomorrow's assignment would be classified as a red-level task. And after the signal, Brant approached Jiko. He stood beside him at the rail and spoke quietly and friendly. He said he'd checked everything twice: the repair kit that was missing, the sealed machine that appeared after the storm, the bonuses that someone is collecting like a harvest. He said he didn't know anything about mechanics, but knew accounting, and accounting showed that Jiho had an account that others didn't have. And then Brant smiled and added that he hadn't come to expose anything, but to offer a partnership. He said that tomorrow would be a red level and that people tend to die during red levels. He said that if there were fewer participants, the pot would get bigger and Jiho's account would grow faster. All he needed was for Jiho to keep quiet at the right moment. Jiho looked at Brant's calm face and realized that the bargaining had already begun and that a refusal would cost a war. He replied that he would think it over until dawn. Brant nodded and left, while Jiho remained at the rail with a clear understanding. Tomorrow, during the Red Mission, Brant would orchestrate a death and arrange it so that the blame would fall on Jiho's silence. Jiho didn't wait for dawn. He went down to the console as soon as Brant's footsteps faded on the gangway. His balance after purchasing the desalinator showed 42 points, and that number was as raw as an open wound. He flipped through the catalog, thinking not about the price, but about time. There were 8 hours left until the Red Mission. He couldn't earn any points in 8 hours. That meant he'd have to fight tomorrow with what he had, people. He went up to the bridge and woke the watch. Ortega, Nomi, Osamu, Darien, and Celine. He told them everything he could without revealing the catalog. That Brant had offered him a deal, that tomorrow the faction would try to kill someone using others' hands during the Red Mission. That any one of them could be the one killed because the watch crew was the main obstacle to Brant's calculations. Ortega asked why Brant had come to Jiho specifically. Jiho replied that Brant considered him the most calculating person on board, and in Brant's world, calculating people are always for sale. Celine said the plan was simple: don't let anyone be left alone. Work in pairs and keep an eye on each other. Osama added that the pairs should be shuffled so that Brant's men wouldn't know in advance who would be teamed up with whom. At dawn, the voice announced a red-level mission. The system reported that a cargo platform carrying coils of steel cable had broken free from its mountings in the middle hold. And as the ship rolled, the platform was smashing through the bulkhead of the water tank. The crew was given 3 hours to retrieve and secure the platform. The voice added that the mission bounty had been doubled and the bonus for 0 casualties tripled. The system was staking a lot on this, which meant it was expecting bloodshed. 20 people descended into the hold. 5 members of Brant's faction went down, while Brant himself remained above at the Koming, citing a bad back. The 2-metric-ton platform rode the deck with every wave, and coils of cable whistled over it like whips. From then on, it was all work, and work was war. Ortega and Osamu were driving wedges under the platform. Nomi and Darien were catching the ends and securing them to the cleats. Jiho stood at the hand winch's hand wheel, taking up slack centimeter by centimeter. The pairs held as if glued in place. And yet the moment came. One of Brant's men, named Golt, suddenly shouted that he saw a leak at the far bulkhead and that they needed someone with a flashlight. He shouted this to Darien, who was standing closest. Darien took a step toward the voice, and Jiho saw a second shadow from the group move to cut him off behind the stack. Jiho dropped the winch and bellowed across the hold that there couldn't be a leak at the far bulkhead because there was a dry cofferdam behind it. Darien froze halfway there. The shadow behind the stack froze as well, and at that very moment, the ship lurched. The platform, with its slack rope still unadjusted, began to move, not toward Darien, but backward, toward where Golt himself was standing. Jiho managed to shout, and Ortega managed to shove Golt in the back, so that the platform passed within a hair's breadth of his feet and crashed into the stack behind which the shadow was hiding. A scream rang out from behind the stack. One of Brant's men, named Velasco, had been pinned by the shin. Celine was there 10 seconds later. They caught the platform 20 minutes later, secured it with hoists, and wedged it in place. The timer went out. A voice announced the mission was complete. No casualties, 1 injured. The pot was split 20 ways, and the bonuses were added on top. Jiho's display showed a plus 270, but the main event happened afterward. Celine put a splint on Velasco and asked him in front of everyone what he'd been doing behind the stack, away from his partner. Velasco remained silent. Gold remained silent. And then Casper spoke up. The accountant said he had been standing on the quarterdeck next to Brant and had heard Brant order Gold before the mission to take the boy to the far bulkhead. Casper was shaking as he spoke, but he spoke until the end. The crowd turned toward Brant. Brant smiled and replied that Casper had misheard him and that the word of a panic monger carried no weight against his own. He was right. There was no evidence. But the looks they gave him as he walked away carried more weight than any evidence. That evening, Jeho sat at the console and looked at the balance. 312. He thought about how today everything had been decided by 3 seconds and a stroke of luck. Tomorrow, luck might not be on his side. The watch needed someone who couldn't be bribed, couldn't be intimidated, and who never slept. He opened the listing for an additional crew member and stared at the price for a long time, 1,000. He had 312. He closed the catalog and bought a harpoon rifle instead. He'd still be in the red. No, the carbine cost 600. He didn't have enough. For 250, he bought the only thing he could, a set of signal flares labeled as found emergency supplies, and he hid 2 of the flares in stashes known only to the watch crew. A poor man's weapon, but better than nothing. For the next 2 days, the system seemed to be taking a break. The assignments were yellow-level tasks: overhaul the pump, unload, and sort the cargo from the aft hold. The watch came off first, collected their bonuses, and Jeho's balance grew like the tide. 500, 740, 990. Ortega watched the crew's coordination and once said something strange to Jiko. He said that in 30 years he'd seen many chief mates, but this was the first time he'd seen a man who commanded as if he'd read tomorrow's events in advance. He said it without mockery and without a question, like a diagnosis. On the 7th night of the voyage, the balance exceeded 1,000, and Jeho went down to the console with a dry throat. He opened the entry for an additional crew member and pressed confirm. The screen asked for the spawn point. Jishio indicated an empty cabin next to his own. The screen asked for the origin story. Jiko wrote that the man had been hiding in the inner hull space since day 1. The screen went dark for 3 heartbeats and then displayed a message confirming the delivery was complete. Jeho walked 5 steps down the corridor and opened the door to the empty cabin. A man was sitting on the bunk. He was about 40 years old, lean and calm, with the hands of a sailor and the eyes of a man who knows how to wait. He stood up and said his name was Aaron and that he was ready to begin his duties. Jiko asked if Aaron remembered how he'd gotten there. Aaron replied calmly that he'd been hiding in the hold since the first day of the voyage. He said this as if reciting a memorized lesson, and that calmness sent a chill down Jeho's spine. He asked Aaron who he had been before coming aboard the ship. Aaron was silent for 4 seconds. Then he said he didn't remember and that it probably didn't matter. Footsteps sounded from behind the bulkhead, and Ortega appeared in the doorway, holding a lantern. The boatswain was making his rounds of the night watch posts. He shone the light on Aren, then on Jeho, and his face turned to stone. He said he'd personally searched the space between the hulls on the 3rd day and that not even a cat could hide there. Then he entered the cabin, closed the door behind him, and said he'd had enough for now. He said that either Jiko would tell him everything right then, or by morning the entire crew would learn that miracles on the Kyrion were following Jiko around. Jiko looked at the boatswain and weighed a lie against the truth. A lie would buy him the night. The truth might win him an ally or bury everything. He remembered how Ortega had silently stood beside him on the night of the mark and made his choice. He told Aaron to step out and wait in the hallway. Then he told Ortega everything about the rust-free door, about the console and the catalog, about the boiler and the bonuses, about the repair kit for the rocket launcher's desalinator, and the price of 1,000 points for the man currently sitting behind the bulkhead. Ortega listened without interrupting, his face unmoving. When Jiko finished, the boatswain was silent for a long time. Then he asked just one thing. Why was Jiko spending points on water and iron for everyone instead of on weapons for himself? Jiko replied that weapons could hold the ship, but they couldn't hold the crew, and without a crew, the carrion was just a coffin with sails. Ortega nodded slowly, the way one nods at a correct answer. He said that now their secret was shared, and that if Jiho ever started buying things not for the ship but to use against people, Ortega himself would stop him. They agreed on that. They decided to show the crew the arena in the morning, along with the legend of the interdeck space. And Ortega promised to publicly state that it was possible to have missed such a hiding place. In the morning, the story worked, sort of. The crew received Arena with caution, but accepted him because the boatswain's word carried a lot of weight. Brant didn't accept it. He circled around Arena the way one circles a machine tool, and loudly expressed surprise at how well-fed the man looked for someone who'd been eating rats in the dark for a week. He didn't accuse him. He once again left the number hanging in the air, and at noon, the system reminded everyone who was in charge on the ship. The voice announced the mission for the 8th day, and the difficulty level was black. The voice reported that the Carrion was entering a dead water zone and that, within 10 hours, the crew would have to manually transfer fuel from the emergency tank to the service tank by passing through the gas hazardous cofferdam corridor. The voice added that the failure would not take a part of the ship, but 10% of the crew selected by the system. For the first time, the stakes weren't things. For the first time, the stakes were people on a list. The deck fell silent. Then everyone spoke at once. Brant cut through the commotion with a steady voice and said what Jiko had expected of him. He said that the most experienced crew members should enter the gas hazardous corridor, and we all know who the most experienced ones are. The Bow Watch. He was offering the system someone else's blood, and he did so under the guise of respect. Jiho took the floor and broke the task down into parts. The cofferdam corridor is narrow, and only 2 people can work there per shift. Shifts are 20 minutes long, otherwise the gas will knock out even a healthy person. So, we don't need heroes, we need an assembly line. 8 pairs, taking turns, according to the schedule, with a doctor at the exit with ammonia and water. He was the first to sign himself and Aaron up for the second hardest shift when the gas had already become a habit, but they hadn't gotten used to it yet. Ortega signed up with Osamu, Noemi took Darien, and then something happened that no one expected. Casper raised his hand and said he was ready to pair up with Golt. The accountant chose Brant as his partner and explained his reasoning simply. He said that after that incident in the hold, he wanted people to work in mixed teams because it's harder to drown each other out that way. Golt opened his mouth and closed it again. To refuse would mean admitting that backstabbing was part of the plan. The pairs headed down according to schedule. The hours dragged on, etched into Jiho's memory through his throat and eyes, the stench of hydrocarbons seeping through a wet rag, the slippery handle of the centrifugal pump, the ticking of the metronome with which Salen marked the shifts. Aaron worked beside him, steady and terrifying. She didn't tire the way people do, and in the cramped confines of the corridor, Jiho thought for the first time about the true price paid by those who come straight from the catalog. At the 6 o'clock mark, the schedule broke down. Velasco, with a splint on his leg, was sitting up by the ventilation damper acting as a watchman, and during his shift, the damper ended up closed. Whether by accident or not, the gas in the corridor built up like a wall. Casper and Golt were in the corridor at that moment. Golt stumbled out toward the exit, blue in the face and coughing. Casper stayed inside, and then Golt did something that shook Carrion more than any mission ever had. He took a deep breath and crawled back in. He dragged Casper out by the collar into the light, and both of them collapsed at Sealan's feet. The doctor suctioned them both out. Velasco swore he hadn't touched the valve. No one believed him anymore, not even Golt, who stared at his leader, Brant, across the deck with a long, empty gaze. The pumping operation was completed in 9 hours and 40 minutes. A voice announced the successful completion of the Black Mission with no losses, and the bonus tripled appeared on the ledgers, making everyone's eyes widen. Jiho's balance had surpassed 800. That evening, for the first time on the voyage, the crew ate a hot meal together in the galley, and Golt sat not next to Brant, but next to Casper. Brant's faction was melting away before their eyes, and Chico allowed himself a quarter of an hour of a simple human dinner. The mistake lay precisely in that quarter of an hour, because Brant wasn't sitting at the communal table. Brant was walking around the ship. And when Jiko went down to the console that night, he saw the light of a flashlight coming from behind the loosely closed door of the partition. He flung the door open. Brant was standing at the console, and the screen was lit. Open on the screen were a catalog, a line entry for an additional crew member, and a purchase log with dates, repair kit, desalinator, rocket launchers, Aaron. Brant turned around without a hint of fear and said that a rust-free door on an old ship was an insult to anyone paying attention, and that he'd been waiting for this discovery ever since the day the desalinator was installed. Then he raised his hand, and Jaiho saw a rocket launcher from the watch's stash in it. Brant said that the situation was now simple. Either starting right now, the catalog would work for the two of them, and the first thing they'd do was buy weapons, or Brant would fire a flare at the ceiling of the quarters, gather the crew, and show everyone the logbook where it was written in black and white that Jiho had bought a man for 1,000 points, just as one buys a winch. He smiled and asked how long Jaiho thought the catalog's owner would survive once 23 people found out that each of them had a price. Yaegu stared at the rocket launcher in Brant's hand and didn't move. Then he did something Brant hadn't anticipated. He stepped aside and cleared the way to the gangway. He said, "Fire." Brant narrowed his eyes. Jiho continued as calmly as if reading a delivery slip. "Let the crew come down here and read the logbook. In the logbook is the repair kit that saved the galley, the water maker that's been providing water for everyone for the past 3 days, defense rocket launchers, and one man who spent 9 hours pumping fuel into the gas tanks for the entire crew. Let the 23 people read what the catalog's owner spent his hard-earned points on, and then let them look at the one who spent a week building up his faction and counting other people's deaths like interest." Brant remained silent. Yeko sealed the deal with a second argument. He said that the console was the personal privilege of the discoverer, and the screen responded only to his hand. A dead Jaiko meant a dead catalog. An exposed Jaiko meant a catalog guarded by the crowd, and only a living, secret Jiko was worth anything. So either shoot or put someone else's stuff back where it belongs. The seconds dragged on like tar. Then Brant lowered the rocket launcher and laughed quietly, almost respectfully. He said that for the first time on this voyage, he'd spoken with someone who could think faster than him. He set the flare gun on the console and made a new proposal. Not a partnership, but a truce. He'd keep quiet about the catalog. Jiko would keep quiet about the hold in the hatch, and from there, everyone would play their own game. Jiso replied that he accepted the truce, but with one condition. If even one person on the carry-on dies at the hands of another, Chiso's first move won't be to buy a weapon. It'll be to buy the truth, and that truth will include names. Brant nodded and went upstairs. Jiko remained at the console and unclenched his fingers, which had been holding a second flare gun with the hammer cocked in his pocket the whole time. In the morning, he told Ortega everything, and the boatswain rubbed his face with his palm for a long time. Ortega said that a truce with a man like that was like ice in the tropics, and that now the secret had 3 keepers, and a secret shared by 3 was already public knowledge. In the afternoon, the system issued the 9th day's assignment, and it was almost merciful. Hoist a new top light onto the mainmast and stretch out the antenna from a coil of copper cable. They worked cheerfully because after the black corridor, the height felt like a resort. Nomi walked along the yardarm as if on a boulevard. Casper sat on the E and joked for the first time on this voyage. The boiler drizzled a light rain of 23 drops, and the evening was almost peaceful. And at night, Jiho was awakened not by the system's chime, but by Aaron's hand. Aaron stood over the bunk with the face of a man who'd dreamed someone else's dream. He said he'd remembered something, not a name nor the shore. He'd remembered that ceiling, the riveted seam, and the 3 rivets offset at the left corner. He said he'd woken up under that seam before, not on this flight. Jiko sat up on the bunk and felt a chill travel from his spine to the back of his head. He asked, "What else?" Ershin replied that he remembered a sound. The bell rings 9 times in a row, but there aren't 9 glasses. And he remembers a word. The word Valgren, nothing else. Jiko didn't sleep until dawn, and at dawn, the system itself explained the word. The air rang out as it had never rung before, long and low. A voice announced that the carry-on was entering the oncoming traffic zone. The Valgren is heading toward them with a crew enlisted under the same rules. In 2 days, the ships will meet at the exchange point. The voice said that, at the exchange point, the system would replenish the supplies of only one ship. Which one would be decided by the crews themselves by any means necessary. The voice fell silent, then added one final sentence that left the deck in the stunned silence. 7 of the 25 passengers remained aboard the Valgren, and all 7 had completed their assignments ahead of schedule. The men stood there, silently dividing 7 by 23 in their heads. Ortega was the first to voice what all the sailors on board had realized. A crew that had dwindled from 25 to 7 in 9 days hadn't failed a single task. A crew like that was cutting its own throat. And now these 7 were heading our way, and they needed our supplies. Jiko gazed at the horizon where there was nothing but light for the moment, and considered the new challenge. He had 900 points, a truce with the predator behind him, and a man with no memory who remembered the name of the enemy ship. 2 days until the rendezvous. Brant approached from the side, stood next to him, and said quietly that a truce was a truce, but now was the time to talk about weapons. And for the first time on this voyage, Jiko couldn't think of anything to say in response. The morning of the 10th day began with a war council that no one had announced. The crew gathered of their own accord by the mast and looked at Jiko rather than at Ortega, and this was news that everyone accepted in silence. Jiko laid out the task as one would lay out the rigging. First, 7 against 23 is not an advantage of numbers, because those 7 have been selected through blood and are surely better armed. Second, Kyrian cannot avoid the confrontation because the exchange point is controlled by the system, and without restocking supplies, the crew will die on its own within a week. Third, that means we must prepare for the worst, and the worst is called aborting. Ortega took charge of the weapons, then for 2 days they worked nonstop on the preparations. Osamu and Nomi are stretching a net made of cargo slings along the side so the grappling hooks will catch on it instead of the bulwark. Darian and Casper are sawing and welding a second-line bulwark out of pipes. Seelan is turning the infirmary into a first aid station and laying out first aid kits all over the deck in conspicuous places. Ortega is teaching 24 landlubbers a simple lesson. Don't try to be a hero. Stand in pairs, back to back, and strike with the shaft, not the tip, because the tip gets stuck. Jiko has barely slept these past 2 days and has gone down to the console 3 times. First, trip down. He'd bought a harpoon carbine for 600 and, as the story goes, made a discovery in the space between the hulls. And Ortega publicly confirmed that after the incident with Aaron, he'd ordered every panel there to be tapped. This time, Golt turned out to be the skeptic. He turned the carbine over in his hands, looked at the factory grease, then at Jiho, and said slowly that on this ship they find exactly what they need and exactly when they need it. He didn't elaborate. He simply placed the carbine at Jiho's feet butt end down, the way a weapon is presented to a commander, and walked back to his station. Second descent. Jiko bought 2 repair kits and a coil of steel cable. The third descent was the hardest because the balance showed 140, and there wasn't even half enough for the crew member's share. He stood in front of the screen and, for the first time, caught himself having a dirty thought. If a massacre broke out tomorrow, the bounties and bonuses would be enormous. He turned off the screen before the thought could fully form, and upstairs, news awaited him that drove the thought home. The air rang out at midnight. A voice announced the nightly threat rating. A target had been assigned, and this time it wasn't Jeho whose palm was burning. Brant stood under a streetlight, staring at his crimson mark, his face as pale as sailcloth. The system had chosen its victim with mocking precision. Brant's death would double tomorrow's rations right before the battle and, at the same time, rid half the crew of a man whom no one liked. Jiko saw people averting their eyes, how Velasco looked at his former leader with a long, expressionless gaze. How Brant himself, for the first time on this voyage, was at a loss for words. It would have been cheapest to remain silent. Jiko struck the gong and assembled the crew. He reminded them of the Night Watch agreement and said that the agreement didn't specify who to guard. So he said that if they let the system buy Brant from them today, tomorrow the system would buy anyone from them, and the price would only go up. He was the first to volunteer for guard duty. Gold stood up silently next, and a ripple of movement swept across the deck like a wave. The four of them stood watch in shifts throughout the night around the man whom, just a week ago, half the ship had dreamed of drowning. Toward morning, Brant called Jiho over and said one sentence quietly and without a smile. He said that all his life he'd believed everything had a price, and that today, for the first time, he'd seen 20 men turn down a double boiler. He said he didn't understand that arithmetic, but he wanted to live long enough to figure it out. The beacon went out at dawn. An hour later, the lookout shouted from the mast. Smoke was rising on the horizon. The Valgren was heading toward them, ahead of schedule and moving fast. Jiko raised the binoculars he'd bought along with the rope and stared for a long time. A low, dark hull, welded sheets along the sides. On the foredeck, something covered with a tarp about the size of a winch. And on the bridge, a man looking at the carry-on through the same kind of binoculars. Jiho lowered the glass and told Ortega that they had about 4 hours. At that moment, Aren, who was standing nearby, said in an even voice that on Valgren's foredeck, under the tarpaulin, stood a steam-powered launching machine that fired harpoons with a cable reaching 300 meters. Jiko slowly turned to him and asked how he knew that. Aren looked at the distant smoke and replied that he didn't know how, but he knew he'd seen that machine in action before, and that last time, Carry On had lost that battle. Jiko spent the 4 hours leading up to the battle trying to undo the past defeat that Aaron remembered. He questioned him the way one would interrogate a malfunctioning flight recorder. Aaron's memories came back in fits and starts. The machine fires a harpoon with a cable. Then Valgren's winch pulls the ships alongside each other. Then 7 of them run across the gangway, and they're fast. Nothing else. That was enough for Jiko. If the harpoon can't be avoided, then we have to make sure the harpoon becomes their problem, not ours. He gathered the watch and laid out a plan that Ortega called Audacity and Osamu called a fisherman's classic. Let them hook us. A fish that pulls harder than the boat will drag the fisherman down. Carry-On was getting ready during the final assembly. Nomi and Darien were securing a purchased steel cable with a huge loop placed under the net along the side to the cleats. Osamu was marking the spot on the deck with an axe. Casper, with Saylin's stopwatch, was rehearsing the countdown aloud. Ortega positions 24 men in the second line behind the pipe bulwark and orders them to lie down until the signal. Jia Ho, with a carbine, climbs into the shade near the boat deck. Valgren approached to within 300 meters and said nothing. The tarpaulin flew off and the steam engine roared to life. The harpoon pierced the bulwark like paper and lodged itself in the deck. Its prongs spread wide. The cable tightened and began to sing. Valgren's winch pulled the ships toward each other, and the water between the hulls began to churn. 7 men in welded armor, armed with short crossbows, watched from their deck, observing the operation rather than a battle. Jiko waited and counted along with Casper. The hulls were 20 meters apart. 15, 10. The 7 raised their hooks, and then Jeko gave the signal. With 2 blows of his axe, Osamu drove in the wedges, and the loop of their rope swept over the enemy's harpoon line right at the scuttle. Ortega knocked out the stopper, and the entire mass of the carrion recoiled under its own momentum. The enemy's rope bore the weight of both ships. The steam engine on Valgren's foredeck groaned, broke free from its foundation, and careened across their deck, sweeping everything away all the way to the superstructure. 2 of the 7 vanished beneath it instantly. The formation broke, and the boarding began differently than the guests had rehearsed. The hooks landed in the taut net instead of the gunwale. The first man to climb over was struck in the chest with an oar by Nomi and fell overboard between the ships. Golt and Velasco simply covered the second man with a cargo net like a fish, but the remaining 3 were truly fast. They passed the bulwark through a gap near the bow and encountered the second line there. From then on, Jiho remembered the fight in flashes.
A crossbow bolt struck the pipe next to his cheek. Ortega and the man in body armor are rolling across the deck. Oren moves so fast the eye can't keep up and wrenches the crossbow from the enemy's hands, along with his fingers. The woman with a scar across her entire face pushes through the line toward Jiho, and the four of them can't stop her. Jiho raises her carbine but can't fire because her own men are behind her. She's already 3 steps away. And then Osamu steps between them with a pike. It all lasts 2 seconds. The pike breaks her swing. Her short blade pierces Osamu under the ribs. Jiho's shot hits her in the chest at point-blank range. Both fall side by side. The fight ended a minute later because Valgren blew a horn from the bridge, and the last of the attackers raised his hands. Celine was already kneeling over Osamu, and from the look on her back, Jiho understood everything before she even raised her head. Osamu was dying. He held Jiho by the sleeve and said that a fisherman knows when his net is full. Then he said that his daughter on shore looked just like her mother, and that if Jiho made it to shore, he should find her and tell her that her father hadn't drowned but had stood his ground. And he loosened his grip. The system's voice announced that the collision was over and that the carrion had been declared a trade vessel. The boiler and the bounties were recorded on the display panels as numbers that no one had ever seen before and that no one looked at. The crew stood silently around Osamu, and, in that silence, the captive, with his hands bound, suddenly laughed. They dragged him to the mast, and he spoke willingly, because he no longer cared. He said there were 25 of them, just like us, that their catalog pioneer, named Ursa, had found the console on the 3rd day, that she was the first to figure out a simple fact. The reward at the final port is divided among the survivors, not rations, not bonuses, the grand prize at the end of the voyage. The fewer survivors on board at the port, the larger the share. He smiled with his broken mouth and asked, "Hasn't our smart Alec told you this yet?" 23 pairs of eyes slowly turned toward Jiho, and the captive was finished off with a second stab. He nodded at Aaron and said that they'd bought types like this twice on Valgren, quiet, obedient, and with no memory. Ursa called them return cargo, because the catalog doesn't create people. The catalog retrieves them from past voyages, from those crews that never made it to port. Aaron stood as white as a top flame, staring at his hands, and Jiho looked at his crew and saw how, in the space of a minute, a wall of 2 questions had risen between him and the men. What else does he know, and what else has he bought? Osamu was buried at sea at sunset. They sewed the body into a sailcloth shroud. Ortega spoke 9 words because he couldn't manage any more, and the plank slid into the water as everyone exhaled in unison, and then no one left. The people remained standing in a semicircle, and the semicircle looked at Jiho. He could have dragged it out. He could have haggled with the crowd over doses of the truth. He looked at the water where Osamu had just vanished and decided that he wouldn't lie to this man, not even to a dead man. He told everything himself, starting from the beginning. The rust-free door, the console, the boiler, and the bonuses, the repair kit they found in the forepeak, the sealed desalination unit, the rocket launchers, the carbine he'd fired today, and the arena for 1,000 points. He spoke in complete silence and never looked away. When he finished, it wasn't Brant who exploded first, but the quiet mechanic Paiva. He shouted that Jiho had played them like pawns, knew the price of their heads, and had kept silent. The crowd began to murmur, and the murmur was dark. And then Casper stepped forward, a notebook in his hand. The accountant said that since the conversation had taken this turn, he demanded an audit and insisted that Jiho open the purchase log in front of witnesses. The 5 of them went downstairs: Jiho, Casper, Ortega, Paiva, and Celine. Casper copied the log line by line, went back upstairs, stood on the cleat, and read it aloud to the entire crew as if it were a report. 3,140 earned points. The repair kit that saved the galley, the water maker that keeps everyone hydrated, the cables that decided today's battle, the rocket launchers, the carbine. 1 person. 0 weapons used against their own. 0 food for themselves. 0 hidden bills. Then Casper closed the notebook and spoke on his own behalf. He said that a week ago, he'd considered Jiho a upstart, but now, as an accountant, he declared that he'd never seen cleaner balance sheets, and that Personally, he entrusted his life to this balance sheet. Paiva sat down on the combing and fell silent. The crowd was cooling down, but hadn't cooled off completely, and Ibron set the rest ablaze. He stepped into the circle, and said he wanted to speak as a bought one. He said he didn't remember his life, but remembered his death, because it had begun to return to him since the day of the battle. He had drowned in the engine room of this very ship on the previous voyage when his crew had failed their mission due to a breach. That voyage had its own catalog and its own owner, too. The owner had bought the weapons during the first week, and by the time they reached the exchange point on board, only 6 remained. No one made it to port. He scanned the deck and concluded that if it weren't for this owner with his ropes and desalination unit, half of those standing here would already be return cargo for someone else's voyage. There was no formal vote. Ortega simply stood next to Jico, then Nomi, then Golt with Velasco, then Celine, then one after another, and within a minute, no one was standing opposite Jico. The crew made their decision with their feet. And that very night, the system showed what it thought of human decisions. The air rang out long and menacingly. The voice announced that the catalog's secret had been revealed to the crew, and that the discoverer's personal privilege was revoked. The voice said that a general catalog was being introduced. From now on, every passenger could see the prices and spend their personal points on their own. Additionally, the system was opening up new items. The voice listed them off, and each line fell like a knife. An individual lifeboat with a month's supply, a personal bulletproof vest, a crossbow, tasteless poison, information on any passenger's balance, and the last line, redemption of one's own share. Any passenger can leave the flight at any time via the lifeboat, reducing the boilers of all those remaining to 1/3 of their capacity. Jico stood among his people and watched as a personal screen with the price list of death lit up above each palm. The system had just made everyone the owner of their own catalog. In the morning, it turned out that everyone had been thinking all night. 3 people, including Paiva, had seen their balances drop. Casper checked the prices and turned pale. Someone had bought poison. It was impossible to tell who, because purchases in the shared catalog were anonymous. Celine silently locked the galley and announced that from that day on, she would be the first to taste the food and water. Jico gathered the watch and said that the war had taken on a new form. Before, the enemy had been the missions and Valgren. Now the enemy was the price list in everyone's hands, and it would be droning in people's ears around the clock. Brant listened while standing off to the side, then stepped forward and placed his personal screen in front of Jaiho, balance display facing up. His balance was high because Brant had always been good at saving up. He said that in his old life, the first things he'd buy would be poison and a skiff. He said he wanted Casper to publicly approve his purchases from this day forward. He said this without a smile, and for the first time in Jico's memory, he looked not like a player, but like a person asking him to hold on. And at noon, the system issued a mission that explained why it had needed the entire night. The voice announced that Carrion was entering a dead calm zone. Speed would drop to 0 for 4 days. Supplies after the battle and trade were calculated for 3 people. The voice said that a position for a ship's wind driver valued at 12,000 points had been opened in the general catalog and that the position was shared by the entire crew. The voice added one last thing. The combined balance of all Carrion's passengers totaled 12,400, and payment was possible only through voluntary contributions. Jico heard 23 people simultaneously look down at their own palms. The system was offering them the chance to survive together at the cost of nearly all of each person's personal points, or for some to survive, according to the price list. A meeting was called at sunset to make a decision together, once and for all. Casper hung a ruled sheet on the mast and drew 2 columns with chalk. The left column showed the cost of the sailboat. The right column showed the total balance and the per-person contribution rate. The rate worked out to nearly 0 for everyone. Jico spoke briefly. Points meant future lifeboats, body armor, and shares in the port. Surrendering them meant being left with nothing for the rest of the voyage. Not handing them over meant drinking seawater in 3 days.
He said he wouldn't force anyone and that he himself was handing over everything down to the last tenth. He placed his palm on the sheet and his balance was the first to be transferred to the total account. Then it was everyone else's turn, and that turn was the story of the voyage told through their faces. Ortega handed everything over in silence. Nomi handed everything over and added that dead, her share in the port would be of no use to her. Galt and Velasco handed over their shares side by side. Celine handed over hers. Aaron handed over his and said that what had been bought had nothing to lose but a second death. Brant walked out to the mast under everyone's gaze, took out his screen, and, with Casper watching, transferred the largest personal balance on board to 0. He said that his whole life he'd been buying his way out of failing ventures, but today, for the first time, he was buying the venture itself. By midnight, there was a shortfall of 600 points on the sheet and 3 who hadn't surrendered, Paiva and 2 from the former faction. Paiva stood at the rail and said he didn't believe they'd get anything back afterward and that the personal lifeboat in his hand was the only honest thing on this ship. No one went to break it. Instead, Darien approached him. The kid whom the voyage had nearly killed twice. He told Paiva that on the first day he'd been hiding up top and they'd fed him. That beneath the keel, a man to whom he was a nobody had pulled him out by the collar. That on this ship his life had already been paid for twice with other people's points, and now it was his turn to pay. He handed over his small share and remained standing nearby. Paiva stared at the kid for a long time, then he cursed, pressed his palm against it, and drained it all. The last 2 followed suit in silence. At exactly midnight, Casper drew the line, 12,100, paid in full. A voice announced the delivery, and a human-sized machine with a ring of blades and a factory seal materialized out of thin air on the tank. A dead calm fell over the ocean at dawn like a lid, and 4 days were compressed into a single sequence. The dead water stretched to the horizon, smooth as metal. The wind-driven engine hummed and pushed the carry-on at 4 knots through the stifling heat. Seelan poured out water by measure and tasted every flask first. At night, the entire crew sleeps on deck in a single camp because they decided to do so themselves and because the poison someone had bought was never found. On the second day, Biva came to Jiho on his own to repair the wind vane bearing. He worked hard and well, and as he left, he muttered that it was the first time he'd seen superiors who were becoming destitute along with everyone else. On the fourth day, a real wind picked up and the stretch of calm came to an end. The voice announced the completion of the collective task and uttered the words everyone had been waiting for, as if they were a verdict. The collective contribution has been credited. Carry-On is heading into the final leg of the road, 7 days' sail to the final port. The deck let out a collective sigh of relief, and someone laughed, and the laughter rolled through the ship. People were hugging each other by the mast. Brant stood there with his 0 balance and smiled like a man with a clear conscience, a new expression for him. And amid all this joy, Jiho noticed the only one who wasn't celebrating. Arin stood on the forecastle with his back to everyone, gazing sternly ahead. Jiko approached. Arin didn't turn around. He said that his memory had returned to him in its entirety that night. The name, the shore, the wife and son he would never see again, and the entire previous voyage from the first day to the last. Jiko asked what he remembered about the last day. Aaron turned around and his eyes looked old. He said that the previous crew had also heard those words 7 days before reaching the final port. That the 6 survivors back then had stood on this very deck and had also embraced each other. He remembered how, on the 7th day, towers and a breakwater appeared on the horizon and how people wept with joy at the railing. And then the port began to fade into thin air along with the horizon, and a voice announced that the final destination could not be reached until Mission 0 was completed. A mission the system only announces when the shore is in sight. Arin fell silent and finished his sentence in a near whisper. Last time, Mission 0 consisted of a single line. Only 1 passenger is allowed at the dock. 6 hours remained, and the final battle, everyone against everyone, began. And in that battle, the ship sank.
He looked Jai-Ho in the eyes and asked what Jai-Ho was going to do in 7 days. When the 23 people who were hugging each other today would hear that same line. Behind them, the crew was laughing by the mast. Ahead, on course, lay 7 days of open sea, and at the end of them awaited a mission in which, according to the system's rules, there could be only one winner. Jai-Ho didn't keep this secret to himself for even a single day. The previous lesson had cost him the trust between himself and the crew, and he had no intention of repeating it. But he couldn't shout about the zero mission across the deck either because panic had killed the last voyage before the knives did. He chose the middle ground. That night, a small council gathered in the infirmary. Ortega, Celine, Casper, Nomi, Golt, Brant, and Aaron. Aaron repeated to everyone what Jai-Ho had told them on the forecastle, a port that vanishes into thin air, a voice announcing a zero mission as the shore comes into view. A single line about a single passenger, 6 hours of carnage, and the ship at the bottom of the sea. Ortega listened with a stony face and then said that neither wedges nor ropes would help against such a line. Brant said the mission was elegant in its vileness. For 7 days, the system would feed them hope only to pit them against each other in the end. Casper asked Aaron for the crucial detail, the exact wording. Aaron closed his eyes and recited the line word for word. 1 passenger from the ship Carry-On is permitted to disembark at the pier. Casper opened his notebook and underlined one word twice. Passenger. He raised his head and reminded everyone how the line had sounded in the old Jai-Ho catalog. Additional crew member, not passenger, crew member. The system itself divided the people on board into 2 categories and never once mixed them up. The voice always said passengers when addressing everyone and crew when referring to the ship. Casper said that if the categories existed, there had to be a transition between them somewhere. In accounting, there's no status without a transaction. The council would have gone down to the console, but the console was no longer there. After the secret was revealed, everyone held the catalog in the palm of their hand. Casper opened his screen and began flipping through the sections as one would flip through a charter. He found an entry on statuses for 5 points and purchased it in full view of everyone. The screen displayed the text. Passengers are participants in the flight and contenders for the destination port's reward. The crew is the property of the flight and ensures the route is completed. Below, in small print, was the reason the whole thing had been set in motion. The transition from passenger status to crew status is carried out voluntarily through personal confirmation. The cost of the transfer is 1,500 points per person. There is no provision for a reverse transfer. The infirmary remained silent while everyone worked out the same math problem in their heads. If 24 people became crew members, only 1 would remain a passenger, and the zero casualty mission would be accomplished without a single drop of blood. 1 would reach the dock according to the rules, while the rest would get there as the ship's crew. Then Salen spoke, and her question was as cold as a scalpel. She asked what the line about the voyage's property meant. Aaron didn't answer right away. He said that he himself was that property, and that property isn't asked if it wants to go home. The crew belongs to the ship. It can be purchased for a new voyage, just as Aaron himself was purchased. Transferring to the crew saves one from a 0-point mission, but may permanently bind one to Carry-On. Brant noted that the system doesn't sell salvation. The system sells a reprieve, and always in fine print. Casper checked the help section again and found that fine print. Crew members can be written off the ship at the final port. The write-off is paid for out of the passenger's reward at the port's rates. The rates were not specified. Jai-Ho summed it up. There's a plan, and it's a terrifying one. 24 people must voluntarily sell themselves as the ship's property and believe that the sole remaining passenger at the port will buy them all back, using a reward whose amount no one knows anything about. Ortega asked who would be that passenger. Jiko replied that it would be whoever the crew chose, and that he himself was ready to be either a passenger or part of the ship's cargo.
Nomi said there was no choice to be made and that the person who had ruined everything for everyone was obvious to all. No one objected, not even Brant. The only issue left was the price. Casper wrote out the calculation in chalk on the bulkhead. 24 transfers of 1,500 each totaled 36,000 points. All balances after the wind run stood at 0. 7 days to earn 36,000 from scratch. In the morning, the system seemed to have overheard their advice and made its own adjustments. The voice announced the rules for the final stretch. The tasks for the last week would be conducted in a participation auction format. Each day, the system would allocate a limited number of spots per task, and the spots would go to those who were the first to confirm their participation. The prize pool for each task was fixed and would be divided only among those who secured a spot. The voice added that the prize pools for the final week had been increased tenfold. The system was openly encouraging them to elbow each other aside for a spot at the trough. Jiko gathered the entire crew by the mast and told them everything. Mission 0. The previous run. A loophole involving statuses, a price of 36,000, the risk of becoming property forever. He spoke while watching the crew turn pale and their faces harden. There was no panic because after the lull, this crew had already put all their eggs in one basket once before, and the basket had held up. Paiva asked only one thing: why should they trust that the passenger at the dock won't take the reward and walk away? Jaiko replied that trust wasn't needed here. Control was needed. Let Casper keep a public record of every 10th point all the way to the dock, and they'll enshrine the write-off formula in a General Assembly resolution. Paiva nodded and said he wouldn't argue with the accounting department. They immediately agreed on the main point against the auction. Spots for missions would be filled in the order determined by Casper, and everyone would voluntarily transfer their entire earnings to the Common Transfer Fund via the point transfer function that Casper had already found in the catalog. The system wanted a greed-driven auction, but got a first-come, first-served list instead. The first auction opened at noon, a black-level mission. 6 slots. Apply a patch to a seam below the waterline loose after a battle while the ship is underway. The pot, 6,000. The 6th in line went overboard via the gangways, and by sunset, the seam was secured with a patch and lashing. 6,000 went into the fund, and Casper's chalk marked the first line of the total on the bulkhead. Jiko stared at the number and forced himself not to rejoice prematurely. The system had been running too smoothly on the first day, and that night he discovered why. While making his rounds, he noticed a light in the rope locker where they were holding the prisoner from Valgren. The prisoner's name was Toivo, and after the battle, the voice had registered him as a passenger on the carry-on, a fact that everyone had almost forgotten amid the commotion. Toivo was sitting against the wall, his palm glowing with an open catalog. The balance displayed above his palm was a 6-digit number. The 7 from Valgrain had been splitting the pots among themselves for the entire voyage, and Toivos was richer than the entire carry-on fund combined. He looked up at Ji-ho and smiled with his broken mouth. He said he'd heard the daytime meeting through the ventilation system from start to finish, and that he had some simple news for Ji-ho. There's no need to transfer him to the crew, and there's no need to buy him out. He's a passenger on the carry-on and intends to remain a passenger. And under the Zero mission, only one will make it to the dock. And the sole passenger on this boat with a 6-figure balance has very good odds. In the morning, Ji-ho told the council about the nighttime conversation, and the math immediately turned into a military briefing. Toivo cannot be transferred to the crew without his consent because the transfer is voluntary. Toivo cannot simply be kept under lock and key until they reach port because the Zero mission requires a single passenger, and there will be 2 of them. And Toivo has a 6-figure balance with which he can buy anything he wants from the general catalog without even leaving the rope locker. Casper finished that last thought aloud, and everyone exchanged glances. The poison, purchased anonymously by someone on the first night of the general catalog, was never found. Now the buyer was obvious. Selen stood up and silently went to the galley to check the supplies. Ortega ordered a search of the rope box, and all they found on Toivo was a hand holding the catalog, which they couldn't take away. Brandt said it was pointless to search a man with money. He doesn't carry a knife. He buys the hand that will wield the knife. They decided to guard the box around the clock in pairs and to test the water and food according to Celine's protocol, without exception. The auctions went on as usual, and the fun grew. On the second day, they earned $5,000 for hauling up and sorting through the anchor chain. On the third day, they earned $7,000 for working in the flooded cofferdam, where the pairs again rotated like clockwork. Mel Caspera brought in $18,000, and half the work was completed in half the time. The men worked fiercely and cheerfully because for the first time on this voyage, fear had a price, and they were clawing that price out with their bare hands. And on the fourth night, Toivo made his move. Paiva and Darien were on duty as the pair manning the box. Toivo spoke quietly to Paiva through the grate. He didn't offer money right away. He asked questions. He asked if Paiva believed that the write-off at the port would be cheap. He asked what would happen if the reward was enough for 20 ransoms instead of 24. He asked who would be crossed off first, and whether it would be the one who had resisted handing over his points until the very end. Then he proposed a simple deal. Paiva would leave the bars unlocked for 10 minutes and receive a transfer of 20,000 points. With that much money, Paiva could buy his own freedom at the port from any passenger. Paiva listened in silence for a very long time. Then he called for Darien and ordered him to bring in Jiho and Casper, and in their presence repeated Toivo's offer word for word. He said that a week ago he might have given it some thought, but now let everyone know what his price is. There is no price. Jiko looked at the old mechanic and thought that the fund had just been replenished by an amount too large to write down with chalk. But Toivo wasn't just buying Paiva. On the fifth day, before dawn, Celine, following protocol, took a sample from the morning water tank, which had been filled overnight from the desalinator. A minute later, she collapsed onto the deck. A spasm twisted her body into an arc, and her lips turned blue. The crew sprang into action within seconds. Casper was already flipping through the catalog with trembling fingers and found a universal antidote. The price was 4,000 points. The fund stood at 23,000. Jiho confirmed the purchase without hesitation, and the ampule materialized out of thin air right in Nomi's hands. Celine began to breathe on her second breath after the injection. She survived because she'd been measuring doses her whole life and had taken a tiny sample. A full sip would have killed her before any antidote could help. They tested the water. The entire morning supply had been poisoned. If not for Celine's protocol, by noon, Carrion would have been left without most of his crew. The trail led to the desalinator's inspection hatch, which could be reached from the ventilation duct, and the duct ran alongside the rope box. Toivo himself, of course, hadn't gone anywhere. In the catalog log, his purchases were anonymous, just like everyone else's. Again, there was no evidence, and again, none was needed. Golt and Velasco headed for the scrap metal bin, and Jiho stood in their way for the second time this voyage. He said that if they killed a passenger for the sake of their own calculations, they would be no different from Valgren's crew, from Carrion's previous crew, or from anyone else who had fed this system with blood. Golt shouted that Celine had nearly died. Jiho replied that he remembered. And that was precisely why Toivo would be kept under lock and key and would arrive at the port alive, because their entire plan hinged on the fact that it was possible to walk away from this game without playing by the rules of blood. If they broke that now, an empty reward for 24 acts of betrayal would await them at the port. The blades lowered, but the price of that morning was terrible. The antidote burned a 4,000 hole in the fund and derailed the day's auction because the crew spent half the day getting sealant drunk and flushing the desalination system. The day ended with the fund at 23,000 instead of 30, and there were 2 days left until the port. That evening, Jiko went down to the rope locker alone. Toivo was sitting by the grate waiting for him. He said he felt sorry for the doctor because he had aimed at her but at the tank. He said this calmly, as one might speak of missing a target. Then he explained his position with the same calm clarity. There were 25 of them on the Volgren too. They too had started with oaths and communal meals. Ursa had also spoken fine words about everyone being together. He had seen how fine words end when the shore comes into view on the horizon. He was the only one of the 7 who realized this before the others, and that's why he lived to see the boarding. He doesn't believe in Jiho's plan. Not because the plan is stupid, the plan is clever. He doesn't believe in it because at the end of any plan stands a man with a reward in his hands and a powerless crowd behind him. It never happens that the man with the reward turns around. Jika listened without interrupting. Then he said he understood him better than he thought, and that in 2 days Toivo would see something he hadn't seen on Valgren. Toivo smirked and replied that in 2 days, one of the 2 of them would see the dock. Upstairs, the air rang out. A voice announced the 6th day auction, black level mission, 9,000 credits. Jiko climbed the ladder and heard a condition that made his jaw drop. In an hour, a fire would break out in the fuel line in the Kuryon's engine room. 8 spots for firefighting. The voice added a separate line. Using purchased firefighting equipment from the catalog would completely void the contract. The system was closing its wallet and opening fire. It was tired of waiting for them to raise their 36,000 and had decided to take what was missing alive. The 8 spots were being filled in order by Casper's team, but the volunteers immediately disrupted the lineup. Ortega crossed Darian off the list of 8 and added himself, saying that the boys had no business in the burning metal. Paiva added himself because he knew the fuel line like the back of his hand. Off they went, Nomi, Golt, Velasco, Aaron, Jiho, and the wiry stoker Mirta from the former faction. The fire broke out right on schedule. A jet of flame shot out of a burst flange, and the fire raced along the pipes as if alive. The next hour was a blur of roaring and soot. Paiva shut off sections of the main line by feel in the smoke. Nomi and Mirta are pumping the manual seawater pump because store-bought fire extinguishers are banned and there are only 3 standard ones on the old ship. Aaron rips off the burning hull plating with his bare hands. His hands are smoldering, but his expression remains unchanged. Jiko and Golt are holding a water curtain in front of the fuel tank, beyond which lies the death of the entire ship. By the end of the hour, they'd driven the fire into a corner of the engine room and began smothering it with wet rags. And then the second flange, one not listed in the system's schematics, burst. A wall of fire rose between the exit and Paiva. The old man found himself trapped in a bag of flames, and the bag was closing in on him. Ortega charged into the fire before anyone could grab him. He wrapped himself in a fire blanket, passed through the wall, scooped Paiva into his arms, and carried him out through the burning gangway, gripping the red-hot handrails with his bare palms because the fire blanket had slipped off onto paw. They were both doused with water from the fire hose. The fire was extinguished 20 minutes later. A voice announced the mission accomplished, and the bonus for no fatalities was added to the fund. 12,000 with bonuses. Mel Casper took out 35,000, but victory had a face, and that face was white with pain. Ortega's palms were burned down to the flesh. Celine, still weak from the poison, treated and bandaged them and said that the bones were intact and his grip would return in a few months. The bosun sat on his bunk with his hands like 2 white stumps, and the first thing he asked was whether the fund was enough. Casper replied that they were 1,000 short. 36 is needed, but there's only 35. The system had set a mocking price for the final auction. 1 spot, 1,000. The task was to spend the last night of the voyage as lookout on the top of the mainmast without a safety harness. After the battle and the storms, the mast swayed in the wind like a pendulum. The system was offering them the chance to earn that last 1,000 at the cost of 1 night above deck at a height where any gust would knock a person off like a drop of water. Half the crew volunteered, but Joho forbade everyone. He said he'd go himself because a passenger is supposed to pay more for their ticket than anyone else. That's when Brandt spoke up. He said there was a cheaper option and asked Casper to open the buyback section in the catalog.
The catalog accepted returns for half the price. Brant suggested selling the Windrunner to the system. The calm had passed. There was steady wind all the way to port, 2 days' sail downwind. The machine, which cost $12,000, would go back for 6 and cover the shortfall with room to spare. The crew remained silent because the wind-driven vessel was their shared, hard-won victory, and selling it was like selling their banner. Ortega raised his bandaged arm and said that people are the banner, and metal is just metal. They voted with their feet, as always. The wind-driven vessel vanished from the tank at sunset, and the fund showed 40,100. With a buffer for the unexpected, as Casper put it, they scheduled the status updates for that very night so as not to give the system time to make further adjustments. The crew lined up on deck under the lanterns, and Casper read the list aloud like a ship's roll call. Each person stepped forward, opened their palm, and spoke their confirmation. The system's voice responded evenly and dispassionately. Transfer complete. Passenger name has been removed from the list of candidates enrolled in the crew of the Carrion. Ortega confirmed the transfer verbally because his hands wouldn't obey him, and the system accepted his voice. Celine transferred. Nomi, Galt, and Velasco followed, one after the other. Casper transferred himself last on the list and joked in a trembling voice that this was the first time he'd run a transfer that wrote him off as company property. Before confirming, Paiva looked at Jiho for a long time and said that a month ago he would have jumped overboard rather than entrust his life to someone else's reward. Then the transfer, as the first of his trio. 23 transfers took place in an hour. Aaron stood aside because he'd been part of the crew on this voyage since birth. Toivo watched the ceremony through the bars of the rope box and didn't say a word. By midnight, only 2 passengers remained aboard the Carrion, Kang Jiho and Toivo, and 40,100 had turned into 4,100 remaining in the fund under Casper's public record. Jiho hadn't slept and was standing on the bow when the sky in the east began to grow gray. He was the first to see it. Towers rose from the dawn mist on the horizon, the breakwater, port cranes. Like frozen storks, the shore was so real it hurt the eyes, and from the deck behind him, Jiho heard the collective gasp of 25 people. The crew poured out onto the deck, and the men stared at the land in silence because it was too terrifying to shout. Aaron stood next to Jiho and said quietly that the last time the shore had looked exactly the same. And in that very second, the air above the Carrion rang out so low that the shrouds trembled. A voice spoke the words that Jiho knew by heart from Aaron. The vessel Carrion has entered the visual range of its final port. Mission 0 is declared. Only one passenger from the vessel Carrion is permitted to disembark at the pier. The voice paused for the duration of a heartbeat and added something that hadn't been there on the previous voyage. 2 passengers have been detected on board. Entry to the port is closed until the condition is met. You have 6 hours to comply. 6 hours and 2 passengers. The deck stared at the rope chest, and Jiho could physically feel the weight of those gazes. The math was simple again, and once more it reeked of blood. 1 passenger too many. Overboard, a decision worth 1 minute. Jiho gathered the crew by the mast and said what he should have said before anyone else. If they solved the problem with murder, then the system, not they, had won the zero-sum game. Then the entire voyage, with its funds and transfers, was simply a long road to the same massacre that had devoured Valgren and the former Carrion. He said he would go talk to Toivo, and that he had 5.5 hours to find the right words. Galt asked grimly what would happen if the words couldn't be found. Jaiko replied that in that case, he himself would become the extra passenger, not Toivo. He said this flatly, and a chill swept across the deck because everyone realized he wasn't bargaining. Jiko wasn't the first to go into the rope box. Brant volunteered first. He said that a man who didn't trust people should speak with a man who hadn't trusted people his whole life. Jiho listened to their conversation through the bars, standing in the shadow of the gangway. Brant wasn't trying to persuade him. He was telling his story about how he'd built his fortune by always being the first to walk away from a deal and leaving his partners to drown. About how, during the first week of the voyage, he'd gathered a faction and counted other people's deaths as dividends. About the mark of the prey, and about the night when 20 men gave up a double boiler for the sake of his skin, even though it would have been cheaper to sleep. He said he didn't believe them at the time and tested them for another month the way you test a counterfeit coin with your teeth. The coin turned out to be real. He said crews like that don't exist and that this one does. Toivo listened to everything and replied with a single question. He asked what would prevent a passenger on the pier from forgetting all those beautiful stories once the reward landed in his palm. Brant paused and answered honestly that nothing would stand in the way except the passenger himself, and that this was the difference Toivo had never seen. Toivo didn't give in, but he didn't laugh either. Jiho heard a crack in his silence and slipped his proposal into that crack. He sat down across from the grate and laid everything out as one would lay out rigging. Toivo doesn't believe a word of it. Fine, let's take word out of it. In the general catalog, there's an entry for a binding contract managed by the system. Jiho purchases the contract and inserts ironclad terms into it. Passenger Kang Jiho undertakes to pay at the final port for the discharge of all 24 crew members of the vessel carry-on, including the transferred passenger Toivo, before any other expenses are covered from the reward. If even a single clause is violated, the passenger's entire reward is transferred in full to the person designated in the contract as the beneficiary. Jiho designates Toivo as the beneficiary. The system executes the contracts itself, and not even the owner of the reward can deceive it. Toivo may not trust Jiho. Let him trust the system's strict adherence to its own rules. Toivo stared at him through the bars for a long time. Then he asked why Jiho was even bothering to ransom him when it would have been easier to leave him to the waves that very morning. Jiko replied that a man had already died on this ship, shielding him with his own body, and that if Jiko started deciding who to let into the lifeboat and who not to, he would have nothing to say to that man's daughter on shore. Toivo turned away toward the bulkhead and sat like that for a minute. Then he said in a subdued voice that Ursa had told them before the boarding that there were only wolves just like them on the other side, and that for the first time he thought she had been wrong. He held out his palm through the bars. The contract was purchased and filled out in the presence of witnesses. Casper read the terms aloud twice. The system confirmed the registration in an even voice, then Toivo opened his screen and confirmed the transfer. A voice announced that passenger Toivo had been removed from the list of applicants and enrolled in the crew of the carry-on. Immediately afterward, a second announcement added that the zero mission requirement had been fulfilled. 1 passenger on board. Port entry is open. The deck let out a sigh, but the sigh got stuck halfway because the voice didn't stop. The system reported that the ship would enter the port on its own via the outer reef along the fairway, which had no lights or markings. Automatic guidance was not provided. 4 hours until the wind shifts. Ortega raised his bandaged hands and laughed for the first time in a week. He said the system had finally started speaking his language: iron, wind, and rocks. He'd take on this mission even without his palms. The last 4 hours of the voyage became the final rehearsal. Ortega stands behind Jehu's shoulder at the helm, reading the water aloud because his hands can't hold the tiller. Nomi, on the bow with the sounding line, shouts out the depths. Paiva, in the engine room, maintains a steady pace like an apothecary balances scales. Aaron, perched on the crow's nest of that very mast without a safety harness, keeps watch for rocks, and his voice drifts down from above, steady as a metronome. Toivo,
took his place at the pump next to Golt, and no one said a word against it. Carrion passed through the first gate of the reef with barely any room to spare, and a rock scraped tangentially along the hull like a fingernail on glass. At the second bend in the channel, the wind shifted and carried the stern toward a ridge, and Joho turned the wheel all the way, listening to Ortega's voice rather than his own fear. The stern passed over a rock at a depth of half a man's height. The third bend was as straight as a line, and at the end of that line lay the calm waters of the harbor. Carrion entered it in the last light of day. The old dry cargo ship, with a patch on its cheek and scorch marks on its superstructure, pulled up to the granite pier, Koenomi threw the stern mooring line over a real cast iron cleat on the real shore. The ship came to a standstill. For the first time during the entire voyage, the deck beneath their feet was no longer rocking, and in that deafening stillness, the system's voice uttered the 5 final words: Mission 0 completed. The vessel Carrion has arrived at its final port. Passenger Kang Ji-ho is invited ashore to receive his voyage award. Crew members are prohibited from leaving the ship until further notice. The gangway slid down onto the granite of its own accord. Ji-ho scanned the deck. 25 faces stared at him in silence. Ortega nodded at him with his chin because his hands were occupied with bandages. Ji-ho stepped onto the gangway and walked down alone. The granite of the pier didn't sway, and this solidity made Jiko's legs wobble as if he were drunk. The port around him was real and empty. No people, no seagulls, no wind. Only cranes against the backdrop of the sunset and a single lantern above the cleat. Beneath the lantern, a table materialized out of thin air, and on the table was a console just like the one from the partition, only with a gold border around the screen. Jiko approached and placed his palm on it. The screen came to life, and a voice spoke right beside him, not from the sky. The voice congratulated the passenger on the completion of the flight and announced the details of the reward. First, return. The passenger will be transported back to the exact point and moment from which he was taken back to his world and his life. Second, flight capital. The total value of the carrion vessel, including all upgrades and the residual fund, has been converted into reward points. The screen displayed a number, and the number was staggering. 118,000 below. The port's price list unfolded, and Jiko saw the price of a human being through the eyes of a buyer for the first time. Discharging a crew member with a return to their own world and their own life. 4,900 for each. Jiko multiplied the figures in his head faster than the system could have suggested. 24 write-offs at 4,900 each came to 117,600. That left 400 from the 118,000. The system had calculated the reward so that it would be just enough, and so that the passenger would have a choice every time to leave 3 or 4 on board and walk away a rich man, or to disembark from the flight. Almost. The voice seemed to have heard his thoughts and said softly that the distribution of the reward was the passenger's exclusive right, and that he could buy out his contractual obligations separately by paying a penalty to the beneficiary in cash while leaving the people on the ship. Until the very last second, the system was selling him away out of his own humanity. Chico smirked and said aloud that she hadn't understood a thing the entire flight. He opened the passenger manifest on the screen and began crossing people off one by one, calling each by their full name: Ortega, Celine, Noemi, Golt, Velasco, Casper, Darian, Paiva, Murtha. He would call out a name, and a chime would ring out from the deck of the carrion. The person at the boarding platform would flinch as the ship's mark faded above their palm. He struck off everyone from his former faction. He struck off those to whom he hadn't spoken more than 10 words during the entire voyage. On the 22nd, he called out Tuivo and heard the system confirm that the contract had been fulfilled in full. On the 23rd, he removed the last person on the list. 2 special cases remained, and Jiho paused on them. He asked the system about Aaron. The voice replied that crew member Arena was part of the return cargo from the previous voyage, and her discharge and return were subject to the standard rate. Jiho asked if the rest of the deceased crew members could be returned in the same way. The voice replied that the port registry contained only the manifest for the carry-on its current voyage. Jiho closed his eyes for a second. He couldn't save everyone. He could only save those on board. He called out Arena's name, and a sound that wasn't a bell rang out from the deck. Arena was standing by the gangway, crying with his face uncovered. The last entry on the manifest was the carry-on itself, and next to it was a notation indicating it belonged to the system. Jiho asked how much the ship cost. For the first time during the entire voyage, the voice paused before answering. Then it said that the ship wasn't for sale because it was a tool for the next recruitment drive. In a month, Carry-On would set sail with 25 new passengers. Jiho looked at his remaining balance. 400 points. He couldn't buy a ship or another life with that. He flipped through the price list and found a cheap entry at the very bottom. An entry in the ship's log with unlimited retention and mandatory presentation to every new passenger on the first day of the voyage. 399 points. Jiho purchased it and dictated the entry while gazing at the dark silhouette of the carry-on. He dictated everything. About the pot that's divided among the participants and how this arithmetic is a trap. About the rust-free door in the aft hold. About passenger and crew statuses and the transfer fee. About the zero-sum task and the loophole. About how the system is strong only as long as the people on board view each other as competitors. He signed the record simply. The passenger, who was the last of 25 to disembark. The system accepted the entry without comment, and to Jiho it seemed that for the first time, its silence was not calculated but rather one of bewilderment. The balance showed 1 point and 6/10. He left them unwritten off. 52 and 6/10 had been credited to him on the first day for 19 pairs of hands in the flooded hold. Let 1 and 6/10 remain as change from this voyage, which he would not give to anyone. A voice announced that the award ceremony was over, and the ban on leaving the ship had been lifted. The gangway hummed beneath their feet, and 25 people stepped onto the granite. What followed was an hour that Jiho would remember for the rest of his life. Unedited, Ortega awkwardly hugged him with his bandaged arms around his shoulders and said he'd served under a dozen captains, but had truly served only one. Celine made him promise to see a doctor in the real world. Casper handed him a notebook with the complete flight record and said he'd never see a balance ledger again, which was why he was leaving accounting to become a teacher. Paiva shook his hand silently, and that was enough. Brandt lingered longer than anyone else. He said he was returning to a world where he had bills and a home, and that for the first time he didn't know why he needed them. Then he said he would track down the families of those who hadn't returned from Carrion's previous flights, using the records he'd asked Casper for, and that this would be the first non-profit endeavor of his life. Toivo was the last to approach. He stood there for a moment, at a loss for words, and finally said that Yrsa had been wrong, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure he himself would never be a wolf. The port began to brighten and fill with the sounds of the real world as people approached the edge of the pier one by one, called out their names, and faded into the morning air, each heading to their own point of return. Aaron was the second to last to leave. He turned around and said that his wife wouldn't believe him, and that his son had grown up without him for 2 years, and that he could now embrace both of these sorrows with his arms. Jiho remained alone on the pier, facing the dark ship. He didn't say goodbye to the system or speak any grand words to it. He simply looked at Carrion and said quietly that in a month, 25 strangers would read the ship's log, and that he was betting his last 1 and 6/10 on the people. Then he walked to the edge of the pier and said his name. The world flickered. He caught a whiff of rain and the cooled asphalt of the port city from his real life. Jaiko stood at the bus stop by the dock gates where he'd been picked up, and the clock on the tower showed the same night, the same hour, the same minute. In the pocket of his work jacket lay a port pass and a single coin. He didn't bother to check what kind it was. A week later, using Casper's notes, he found an address in a fishing village on the coast. The door was opened by a girl who resembled the person Jiho had last seen on the deck holding a boat hook. Jiho told her that he had known her father. that her father hadn't gone missing or drowned, that at the last moment he had stood between someone's death and someone's life and chose to stand. The girl cried, and Jiho told her about the island of silence in the middle of the angry ocean, about the net that was always full, and about the fisherman who knew this better than anyone. He left her house that evening and walked along the water's edge. The sea lay to his right, calm and ordinary, and nowhere on it were there any systems, marks, or cauldrons. Jiho took a coin out of his pocket, tossed it up, caught it, and without looking, put it back. He didn't need to look. He already knew that from this day forward, he would measure his life, not in fishing pots or shares. He would measure it in the people he could turn his back on. Jiho turned up his collar against the wind and headed home. 6 hours and 2 passengers. The timer's display hung over the deck in a crimson glow, unblinking. Jiho stood by the mast and could physically feel how the deck was watching the rope locker. No one spoke aloud what everyone was thinking. The math was simple again, and it smelled of blood once more. 1 passenger too many. Overboard, a decision costing 1 minute and 1 conscience. Jiho saw Velasco shifting his weight by the gangway. He saw Mikita staring at the water over the side for too long. He even saw Nomi standing with her fists clenched. People who had spent a month learning not to be wolves now stood a step away from unlearning it all in a single morning. Jiho struck the bell and gathered the crew by the mast. He spoke slowly and looked each person in the eye in turn. He said he could see their thoughts because he was thinking the very same ones. He said that if they solved the problem through murder, then the system, not they, would have won Mission 0. In that case, the entire voyage, with all its funds, queues, and transfers, would have been nothing more than a long road leading to the same massacre that had devoured Valgren and the former Carrion. In that case, Osamu had died for the wolf's ship. He said he would go talk to Toivo, and that he had 5.5 hours to find the right words. Golt asked grimly what would happen if the words couldn't be found. Jiho replied that then he himself would become the extra passenger, not Toivo. A chill swept across the deck. Celine stepped forward and said that as a doctor and as a human being, she forbade such talk. Jiho replied that he wasn't negotiating and that the crew would have a passenger either way, just perhaps a different one, or take a look at him over his bandaged hands, and remained silent. So heavy a silence that you could have hung it on a hook. Jiho wasn't the first to go into the rope locker. Brant was the first to volunteer. He said that a man who doesn't trust people should be spoken to by a man who himself had never trusted people his whole life. He said that Toivo wouldn't understand the language of trust, but Brant knew the language of distrust perfectly. Jiho agreed and stood in the shadows of the gangway so he could hear. Brant sat on a coil of rope opposite the bars and made no attempt to persuade him. He began to tell his story. He told of his first company, which he had deliberately run into the ground so he could walk away with the money before his partners. Of the second and third, where the pattern repeated itself. About how he'd learned to see right through people and saw a price and expiration date in each one. About how, during the first week of the voyage, he'd gather his faction and count others' deaths as dividends for future boilers. He spoke evenly, without a trace of remorse in his voice, just as one might read a bank statement. Then he told him about the night of the mark, how he woke up with a crimson mark on his palm, and how he realized in a split second that his death would benefit everyone on board, without exception, how he waited for footsteps in the darkness and estimated how many would come, and how, instead of killers, a guard of people formed around him, half of whom had a score to settle with him. He said he didn't believe it at the time. He decided it was some kind of spectacle staged by Jiho to consolidate his power. He'd been scrutinizing this crew for another month, just as one would test a counterfeit coin by running it over one's teeth. He watched as they adjusted their sights to 0 on the wind-up gun, as they walked into the fire for Old Man Paivu, as they placed his own purchases under surveillance at his own request and never once held his past against him. The coin turned out to be genuine. He said that crews like this don't exist, and yet this one does. And that he, an old liar who can spot a lie a mile away, was saying this with a clear head. Toivo listened without interrupting, his face unmoving. Then he replied with a single question. He asked What would prevent the passenger on the pier from forgetting all the beautiful stories once the reward was placed in the palm of his hand, and there would be no one left standing between him and the reward? Brant paused and answered honestly that nothing would stand in the way except the passenger himself, and that this was the difference Toivo had never seen up close, the difference between a man bound by rules and a man bound by what's inside him. Toivo didn't give in, but he didn't laugh either. Jaco sensed a crack in his silence and slipped into that crack with his proposal. He took Brant's place by the bars, sat down on the same bench, and laid everything out as one would lay out rigging before work. He said that Toivo didn't trust a word, and he was right not to, because a word is the weakest currency in the world. All right, let's remove the word promise from the deal entirely. The general catalog includes an item for a system-managed binding contract. Casper found it during the audit. Jiho purchases the contract and inserts ironclad terms into it. Passenger Kang Jiho undertakes to pay, at the final port, for the discharge of all 24 crew members of the vessel Carry-On, including the transferred passenger Toivo, before any other expenses are covered from the reward. Discharge must follow the ship's roll call without exception. If even a single clause is violated, the passenger's entire reward is transferred in full to the person designated in the contract as the beneficiary. Jiho designates Toivo as the beneficiary. The system executes contracts on its own, and not even the owner of the reward can deceive it, because for the system, its own rules are sacrosanct. Toivo may not trust Jiho or trust people in general. Let him trust the system's strict adherence to its own provisions. Toivo holds fast to this belief throughout the entire flight, and it has never failed him. Toivo stared at him through the bars for a long time, and for the first time in all those days, what he saw in his eyes was not superiority, but the workings of the mind. He asked why Jiho was even bothering to ransom him. He had tried to kill this crew 3 times. He had poisoned the water and nearly killed the doctor. It would have been simpler and cleaner to cast him into the waves that very morning, and no court in any world would have questioned it. Jiko replied that a man had already died on this ship, a man who had shielded him with his own body without asking whether he deserved it, and that if Jiko started deciding who to let into the lifeboat and who not to, that standard would sooner or later apply to everyone. Then he would have nothing to say to that man's daughter on shore. Toivo turned away toward the bulkhead and sat like that for a minute. Then he said quietly that before the boarding, Ursa had gathered them on deck and said that on the other side there were only wolves just like them, and there was no one to pity there. That he'd believed her then because on Valgren that was true of them as well. And that, for the first time in 2 oceans, he thought she'd been wrong. He turned and held out his hand through the grating. They'd purchased and filled out the contract in front of witnesses on deck. Casper read the terms aloud twice, and out of old habit, demanded that a clause regarding the public nature of the execution be added. Celine stood nearby, though her legs were still unsteady. The system confirmed the registration in an even voice, and the text of the contract hung in the air in golden lines for 10 seconds so that everyone could read it. Then Toivo opened his screen. He hesitated for a moment, looking at his 6-figure balance, which in a minute would become just a number without any power. Then he confirmed the transfer. A voice announced that passenger Toivo had been removed from the list of applicants and enrolled in the crew of the Carry-On. Immediately afterward, a second announcement added that the 0 assignment condition had been met. 1 passenger on board. Entry into the port is open. The deck exhaled, but the sigh got stuck halfway because the voice hadn't fallen silent. The system reported that the ship would enter the port independently via the outer reef along the fairway, which had no lights or markings. Automatic pilotage was not provided. Time until the wind shifts, 4 hours. When the wind shifts, the fairway will become impassable until the next voyage. The crew exchanged glances, and someone cursed. The system played a 0-point mission and immediately issued a penalty for the loss. Ortega raised his bandaged hands and laughed for the first time in a week. He said that after all the contract catalogs and status reports, the system had finally started speaking his language. Iron, wind, and rocks. The boatswain had been speaking this language for 30 years, and he'd take on this mission even without his palms. The last 4 hours of the voyage became his final montage, and Jiho committed it to memory in frames. Ortega stands behind him at the helm, reading the water aloud because his hands can't hold the tiller. He sees the color of the depth by its hue and the eddies above the shoal by the ripples on the surface, and translates all of this into degrees of the helm. Nomi is at the bow with a handheld depth sounder, and her voice echoes the depths like test tubes. Paiva in the engine room maintains a steady pace like an apothecary holds a scale, and the engine obeys his fingertips. Aaron, perched on the crow's nest of that very mast without a safety harness, scans for rocks from above, and his voice falls onto the deck as steady as a metronome. Toivo took his place at the hand pump next to Golt in case of a hole, and no one said a word against it, and Golt silently moved aside to make room. Carry On passed through the first gate of the reef with barely any clearance, and a rock scraped along the hull like a fingernail on glass. 25 men felt that sound in their spines. At the second bend in the channel, the wind picked up earlier than expected and drove the stern toward the ridge. Jiho turned the wheel all the way, listening to Ortega's voice rather than his own fear, and counting the seconds aloud along with Casper. The stern passed over a rock at a depth of half a person's height, and Noemi on the bow didn't unclench her fingers from the chart table until a minute later. The third bend was as straight as a line, and at the end of that line lay the calm waters of the harbor. The carrion entered the harbor with the last light of day. The old, dry cargo ship with a patch on its cheek, scorch marks from fire on the superstructure, and a side stripped down to the metal, approached the granite pier. Nomi threw the mooring line over a real cast-iron cleat on the real shore, and the line tightened and creaked as it bore the weight of this whole affair. The ship came to a standstill. For the first time during the entire voyage, the deck beneath their feet was no longer rocking, and the silence of this stillness struck their ears harder than the storm. And in that deafening silence, the system's voice uttered its final words, Mission Zero complete. The vessel Carrion has arrived at its final port. Passenger Kang Ji-ho is invited to the pier to receive his voyage award. Crew members are prohibited from leaving the ship until further notice. The gangway slid down onto the granite on its own without a single hand to guide it. Ji-ho scanned the deck with his eyes. 25 faces stared at him in silence, and in those faces, everything was evident at once. Hope, fear, exhaustion, and the faith they had chosen for themselves a month ago and reaffirmed every day. Ortega nodded at him with his chin because his hands were occupied with bandages. Salian motioned for him to go with just her lips. Ji-ho stepped onto the gangway and walked down alone, and every step on the echoing metal sounded like a beat from that drum on the first day. The granite of the pier didn't sway, and this solidity made Ji-ho's legs wobble as if he were drunk. He stood on stone that didn't breathe beneath his soles, and his body refused to believe such a luxury was possible. The port around him was real and empty. No people, no seagulls, no wind, warehouses with closed gates, cranes against the backdrop of the sunset, frozen like cranes standing on one leg, rails stretching into the twilight between the warehouses, and a single streetlight above the nearest bollard glowing with an even yellow light. Beneath the streetlight, a table materialized out of thin air, and on the table was a console just like the one from the partition, only with a gold border around the screen. The system welcomed its victor with great fanfare. Ji-ho stepped forward and placed his palm. The screen came to life, and a voice spoke right beside him, not from the sky, and in that closeness there was something of a money changer who had finally awaited a customer. The voice congratulated the passenger on the completion of the flight and announced the details of the reward. First, return.
The passenger will be transported to the exact point and moment from which he was taken back to his world and his life, without any loss of time and without any traces of the flight on his body. Second, flight capital. The total value of the carry-on vessel, including all upgrades, the residual fund, and the bonus for a unique completion, was converted into reward points. The screen displayed a number, and the number was staggering 118,000. Jiko stared at it and recalled how, a month ago, he had trembled at the sight of his first 50. Below, the port's price list unfolded, and for the first time, Jiko saw the price of a human being through the eyes of a buyer. The removal of a crew member from the vessel, with return to their own world and their own life, 4,900 for each one. Jiko did the math in his head faster than the system could have suggested. 24 discharges at 4,900 each came to 117,600. That left 400 from the 118,000. He stood there in silence because he understood the scheme to the very core. The system had calculated the reward so that it would be just enough, and so that the temptation would have a precise price. Leave 3 on board and walk away with nearly 15,000. Leave 5 and walk away a rich man. Every name crossed off turned into a fortune. The system was setting its final trap, not with water and fire, but with pure arithmetic, just as it had set the first one in the flooded hold a month ago. The circle was closing. The voice seemed to have heard his thoughts and said softly that the distribution of the reward was the passenger's exclusive right. That contractual obligations to the beneficiary could be settled separately by paying him a penalty in cash, while leaving the people on the ship, and no one in the passenger's homeworld would ever find out about it. The system held the door ajar for the last second. The system kept the door ajar and revealed gold through the crack. Jiho smirked and said aloud that she hadn't understood a thing the entire flight, that she'd been looking at these people for a month and had seen nothing but balance sheets. He opened the passenger manifest on the screen and began crossing people off one by one, calling each by their full name while looking not at the screen, but at the dark silhouette of Carrion at the dock. Ortega. A clang came from the deck, and a broad figure by the gangway flinched. Celine, Noemi, Galt, Velasco, Casper, Darian Paiva, Mirta. He called out the names of his former faction and the names of those to whom he hadn't spoken 10 words during the entire voyage, and his hand didn't pause for a second because a pause would have meant weighing them, and he had sworn never to weigh people. The 22nd name he called was Toivo. The system confirmed the write-off and, on a separate line, confirmed the fulfillment of the binding contract in full. Jiho thought he detected a flicker of annoyance in the even voice, but perhaps it was just an echo from the cargo holds. As a 23rd entry, he wrote off the last person on the list. The balance showed 5,300. 2 special cases remained, and Jiho paused on them for the first time. He asked the system about Arena. The voice replied that crew member Arena was part of the return cargo from the previous flight, and his discharge and return to his own world would be charged at the standard rate with no surcharges. Jityo asked a second question that had been burning in his mind ever since the night of Arena's revelations. He asked if it was possible to return the others in the same way, those who had drowned in Carrion's past engine room, those whom Ursa had purchased on Valgren, and everyone listed somewhere in these registries as return cargo. A voice replied that the port's registry contained only the Carrion's passenger manifest for the current voyage, and that passengers were not granted access to other registries. Jiko closed his eyes for a second. He couldn't save everyone. This knowledge settled on his shoulders like a wet tarp, and he bore its weight. He could save those on board. He called out Arin's name. A sound that wasn't a bell rang out from the deck. Aaron was standing by the gangway, crying with his face uncovered, and Nomi was holding him by the shoulder. The balance read 400. The last entry on the manifest was Carrion himself, and next to his name was a mark indicating he belonged to the system. Jiho asked how much the ship cost. For the first time during the entire voyage, the voice paused before answering.
and that pause was more precious to him than all the bonuses combined. Then the voice said that the ship was not for sale because it was a tool for the next recruitment drive. In a month, Carrion would set sail with 25 new passengers, and the voyages would continue as long as there was demand for second chances. Jiho stood there, staring at the 400 credits. With them, he couldn't buy a ship or another life or even a rowboat. The system had left him exactly enough so that he would walk away empty-handed and with a full refund. He flipped through the port's price list from top to bottom, past weapons, past luxuries, past services, and at the very bottom found a line printed in small type. Entry in the ship's log with unlimited retention period and mandatory presentation to every new passenger on the first day of the voyage. 300 to 99 points. The line was clearly there for reporting purposes, and no one had ever purchased it. Jiko bought it and dictated the entry while gazing at the ship's dark silhouette. He dictated everything without holding anything back, just as one dictates a will. About the pot that is divided among the number of participants, and about how this arithmetic is the first and foremost trap. About how another's death will always be profitable, and that this profit is poison. About the rust-free door in the aft hold behind the engine room bulkhead. About the catalog of passenger and crew statuses, the transfer fee, and the loophole of the zero assignment clause. About the loot tags and the night security contract. About how the system is strong only as long as the people on board view each other as competitors and weakens with every person who decides otherwise. He added 3 names at the end. Osamu, who stood, Ortega, who burned, Casper, who counted. Let the new 25 know that, before them, there were people here, not mere tokens. He signed the log simply. The passenger who disembarked last out of the 25. The system accepted the entry without a single comment, and to Jiho, it seemed that, for the first time, its silence was not calculated but rather one of bewilderment. The machine knew how to buy people, but it couldn't understand why a person would spend their last bit on strangers they'd never see. The balance showed 1 point and 6/10. Jiko left them unspent, and he did so deliberately. 52 and 6/10 had been credited to him on the first day for 19 pairs of hands in the flooded hold. Let 1 and 6/10 remain as change from this voyage, change that he would give up neither to the system, nor to greed, nor to fear. A voice announced that the distribution of the reward was complete, and the ban on leaving the ship had been lifted. The gangway hummed beneath their feet, and 25 people stepped onto the granite, filling the pier with the sound of footsteps for the first time in an eternity. What followed was an hour that Jiho would remember for the rest of his life, in its entirety, and without any editing. Ortega awkwardly hugged him with his bandaged arms around his shoulders and said that he'd served under a dozen captains, but had truly served only one. And that if, in the real world, Jiho ever set sail, he should find himself a boatswain with scars on his palms. Seelin made him promise to see a doctor and added that she would now keep the test records for the rest of her life because the habit of saving people takes root deeper than poison. Casper handed him a notebook with a complete record of the voyage, from the first 50 to the last 10, and said that he would never see cleaner balance sheets again, and was therefore leaving accounting to go into teaching. Let at least someone teach the young that numbers are always about people. Paiva shook his hand in silence, and that handshake was enough to convey everything left unsaid. Darien said he was going to train to be a lifeguard, and that he'd decided this even back under the keel when a stranger's hand had shoved the mouthpiece back into his mouth. Nomi simply punched him in the shoulder with her fist, and that blow spoke louder than any speech. Golt and Velasco approached together, and Golt said he owed Casper his life, while Jiho owed him the fact that despite all their animosity, they'd called out to him from the hold. Mirta invited everyone to her town for a proper dinner without rationed mugs. Brant lingered longer than anyone else. He said he was returning to a world where he had accounts to settle at home and partners, and that for the first time, he didn't know why he needed them. Then he said he'd ask Casper for copies of the records of past voyages and that he would find the families of those who hadn't returned from Carrion and Valgren. He'll tell them that their loved ones aren't missing. This will be the first non-profit case of his life, and he suspects it will be the most costly. Toivo was the last to approach. He stood there for a moment at a loss for words, and finally said that Ursa had been wrong and that he would spend the rest of his life proving that mistake for himself. Then he added that if Jiho ever needed someone who knew how wolves think, he was at his disposal. The port began to brighten and fill with the sounds of the real world. Somewhere, a real tugboat rumbled in the distance. One by one, people approached the edge of the pier, called out their names, and faded into the morning air, each heading to their own point of return. Aaron was the second to last to leave. He turned around and said that his wife wouldn't believe a single word he said, and that his son had grown up without him for 2 years, and that he could now embrace both of these sorrows with his own hands. He said that he had been reborn on this ship and that he was no longer willing to die a second time. Jiho remained alone on the pier, facing the dark ship. He didn't say goodbye to the system or speak grand words to it because grand words are also a form of currency, and he had paid her in full. He simply looked at the carrion from bow to stern, at the bandage on its cheekbone, at the scorched superstructure, at the mast where a man with no memory stood without a safety harness. And he said quietly that in a month, 25 strangers would read the ship's log on the very first day, and that he was betting his last 1 6/10 on the people. Then he walked to the edge of the pier and said his name. The world flickered. The scent of rain, cooled asphalt, and creosote from the port city of his real life filled the air. Jiko stood at the bus stop by the dock gate from which he'd been picked up, and the clock on the tower showed the same night, the same hour, the same minute. A relief worker walked by and nodded to him as if nothing had happened because not a single second had passed in this world. In the pocket of his work jacket lay a port pass and a single coin. Jiho didn't bother to check what kind it was. The first week, he relearned simple things: drinking water without counting the sips, sleeping without listening to the bulkheads, not counting the people on the bus. In the second week, he found an address in a fishing village on the coast and traveled halfway across the country to get there. The door was opened by a girl in her 20s who resembled the man Jiho had last seen on deck, holding a boat hook. Jiho told her that he had known her father, that her father hadn't gone missing or drowned as she'd been told, that at the last minute he had stood between someone's death and someone's life and had chosen to stand, and that this choice had saved the man now standing before her. The girl cried on the threshold, then sat him down to drink tea, and Jiko told her stories until dark. About the island of silence in the middle of the treacherous ocean, about the net that was always full, about the fisherman who tied knots faster than anyone and knew when it was time to haul in the net. He didn't tell her about the systems and boilers because she needed a father, not a game. As he left her Casper's notebook open to the page where, next to the name Osamu, was a bonus for 0 losses. He left her that evening and walked along the water's edge. The sea lay calm and ordinary to his right, and nowhere on it were there any markers, timers, or crimson numbers. The ordinary lights of ordinary ships went about their ordinary business. Jiho took a coin out of his pocket, tossed it up, caught it, and, without looking, put it back. He didn't need to look. He already knew the most important thing he'd taken away from that voyage, and that it would now be the measure of all things for the rest of his days. Life isn't measured in boilers or shares. Life is measured in the people you can turn your back on. Jiko turned up his collar against the wind and headed home. The reward consisted of his return and 118,000 points calculated to cover the ransom for all 24 crew members. And right up to the very end, the system tempted Jiho to leave some of the people behind for the sake of his fortune. But he accounted for everyone by name, including Toivo under contract and Arena from the previous flight. With the remainder, he entered into the ships a mandatory message for future passengers detailing all the system's pitfalls and the names of the flight's heroes, keeping for himself 1 whole and 6/10 of a point as a memento of the first day. The crew said their goodbyes at the dock and went their separate ways. Brant set out to find the families of those who had perished on past voyages. Aren returned to his wife and son, and Jiho fulfilled his duty to Osamu by finding his daughter and telling her that her father had stood his ground until the very end, after which he returned to his normal life with a new perspective on everything.